This is the Toshiba M675 4-head hi-fi stereo VCR Plus with, you guessed it, easy icon menu programming. In the late 90s, it was reviewed by Budget Audio Enthusiast as a good value for the price if you don't mind a lot of tape noise. And yeah, I don't think I mind at all. Howdy doody, buckaroonies. So, my friend David Hillowitz and I have been meaning to collaborate on something for ages now, but we didn't really know what to do. We thought about doing something with acoustic instruments, or maybe something with our collections of synths and mashing it all together, but we just couldn't think of something that felt too particularly compelling. Until one day, we hatched an idea that we just couldn't get out of our heads. It might not work, but it was too interesting to not try. Recently, we've both been on a little bit of a tape kick, and we wondered if VHS could be the sort of ideal solution for a cheap tape deck hack. After all, VHS as a medium is actually pretty decent, and given how outdated it is, it's incredibly affordable these days. Although a VCR wasn't designed with making sample libraries in mind, we figured that it'd be the perfect way to create a sort of nostalgic VHS synth library packed with the sounds of our childhoods. So I hopped onto the internet box to find a VHS player that was at least reported to be working. After I found one, I dug around the internet to check for manuals and user guides to find a bit more information, and it turns out the Toshiba M675 had dual line inputs, 2 recording speeds, and offered stereo recording. So, into the cart it went. I also grabbed a box of VHS tapes from another listing, and I waited. A couple days later, the VCR showed up, but the tapes were nowhere to be found. So I waited, and waited, and waited some more. For some reason, the person I ordered these from never actually shipped the tapes out, so I just canceled my order. A couple weeks later, on a random Saturday, my wife and I decided to head out to the city to a different flea market and antique store to look for some furniture or other odds and ends, and lo and behold, I found the jackpot. Here we've got Frosty the Snowman, the animated classic that was released on VHS actually just a few days after I was born. I remember watching this as a kid all the time at my grandma's house. Fox and the Hound was another one I also really loved as a kid. I remember though my parents actually banned my sister from watching this because every time she would end up crying for hours on end. It's actually kind of a brutally sad film in hindsight. Believe it or not, I also found Batman, Mask of the Phantasm. My dad ran a really successful electronics shop for years when I was a kid, and I remember going to work with my dad at his shop and watching this on the big TV. I thought it was just the coolest thing in the world to watch Batman on like 20 TVs at once. Of course, I couldn't leave without a copy of The Lion King. I burned through probably a dozen tapes of this as a kid, and still to this day, I'm pretty sure I can recite almost the entire thing. I think both my parents actually live in fear of ever hearing this movie again. I pulled the tapes out and noticed that they were all actually at the end of the tape, which kind of stood out to me. It was really interesting to think how these tapes had been played by someone else at some point. It hit the end of the tape, and the tapes were put back in the box just like any other time, but this time they sat for who knows how many years and then probably eventually got tucked away in storage somewhere, only to end up at a flea market some 30 years later. VHS tapes in hand, now it was time to put the VCR to the test and find out if it does actually work after all. Given it was past the return period at this point, I was either about to make a sample library or inherit a $20 paperweight. Unfortunately, after first testing things out, the VCR didn't actually seem to be working. Although it did seem to play, stop, rewind, and fast forward, and it seemed to enter the record mode, it wasn't actually writing to the tape for some reason. After digging through the manual, I found some troubleshooting steps that mentioned changing the inputs and cycling back to the one you want. That was easy enough, but despite popping in some fresh batteries on the remote didn't work either. Multi-tool and frustration freshly in hand, I cracked open the remote to see what was going on. After a little bit of dusting off and a quick wipe down with some alcohol, the remote seemed to finally start responding again, which means now it's go time. VHS tapes come in two major flavors: blank tapes and commercial tapes. Blank tapes are meant to be recorded over, and commercial tapes are the ones released with media already printed onto them. To prevent you from accidentally overwriting your treasured copy of Frosty the Snowman, for instance, there's a little write tab that's missing on the bottom corner of this tape. If we check out the blank Sony tape, though, we'll see that there's a little plastic square here which allows you to write over the blank tape using the record function on the VCR. With this project, I really wanted to capture the nostalgic sound of older, used tapes, so I had to override this memory protection with an extremely risky high-tech hack. It was a piece of tape. I wanted to try to recreate a bunch of those old-school late 80s and early 90s sounds you would hear on old movies and shows. For this, I used a synth that has a bunch of different sound engines available that would readily recreate these old-school pads and leads and plucks and other sounds I remember so clearly from my childhood on tapes like these. To actually record the sounds, I had to get a cable that would adapt the synth into the line inputs of the VCR. Luckily, after some testing, it turns out I didn't need to feed it a dummy video signal, so I could just plug in the audio jacks and get the sound recorded. I also set the VCR to slow playback mode. This way, the tape would record at a much slower speed and give me just a bit more of that warble and dirt and grime, because after all, we're really after the character here. It was a bit of a challenge to set the right level because the VCR doesn't have any kind of input meter, but after just a bit of trial and error, I found a level that seemed to work for pretty much any sound. That said, some of the sounds actually seem to be just a little bit better by overshooting the level just a touch. Because we're dealing with tape here, we're getting the actual tape saturation and compression, which sounds a lot more pleasing than harsh digital clipping. After every couple sounds, I swapped out the tapes to record over different movies to get a bit more variety, since tape is so chaotic and temperamental. I was actually kind of surprised at how each VHS tape had its own sort of flavor. Each one seemed to really be suited to almost a different type of sound. Once I had the sounds recorded, I chopped them up and edited the samples down to clean out any excessive noise or pops and wrapped them up in Decent Sampler. A couple days later, David sent me his patches and it was time to wrap it all up, so I spent a couple days creating the UI and coding in all of the features. It was also interesting to hear how many subtleties there were to all the sounds, and the differences between our two VCRs was actually fairly drastic in terms of the overall quality and character. This was a really fun experiment, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. It was cool to create the sounds of my childhood and place them onto the movies of my childhood. Although it was sort of sad and weird to destroy, I guess, a part of myself in doing that, it was cool to think how sort of full circle the creative process had become, and I think it all kind of balances out in the end. I can't say that I would recommend using a VCR as a tape machine because it is sort of a pain in the ass and very temperamental to work with, but if you happen to have one lying around, it might be worth a shot because it was pretty cool. The idea that sound can convey a feeling is one of the most deeply fascinating parts to me about the world of music and sound design. Knowing that a synth line can feel lonely or mourning, or a guitar can feel like the desert sand whipping against your face in the wind, or the idea that the warm tones of Saturday morning as a kid can be translated into audio is such a captivating idea. So, whatever it is you might be working on this week, maybe see if there's a way to add a little bit of your own special sauce of what makes you, you. Who knows, it might really add a unique sort of twist to the whole thing. If you want to check out the library that David and I have created, you can find that linked down below, and of course there is a free version as well if you want to check it out. A huge thank you to David for participating in this whole process. This was a lot of fun, and who knows, maybe we'll do another library thing together at some point. Until then, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and of course, as always, I hope this inspires you to get out there and make something awesome.